Hello, everyone, and greetings from our deck. So I apologize in advance for the lawnmower and our crazy chihuahua barking in the background. I'm Matt Bechtel, and I'm going to share a reading of an excerpt from my contribution to the dystopian states of America. But as you can see on the cover, in that bottom line there, I was not just a contributing author, but also the editor of this project. And so I want to take this moment, because you're all captive audience and you can't go anywhere, to express my heartfelt appreciation to all the authors who contributed their time and their talents to this anthology and this essential cause. Gang, this is not our future, but this is our book, and I could not be more proud of what we all created together. So, as I hold up the front cover and read the names off the back, good marketing all at once, thank you so much, Linda Addison, Abby Bechtel, Brad Boucher, Nadia Balkin, Dana Cameron, William D. Carl, G.D. Dearborn, Jeff Deck, Dan Foley, C.M. Franklin, Donjoy Gam, Christopher Golden, Justine Graken, Michelle Renee Lane, Tim Lebin, Stephen Lomer, Jonathan Mayberry, Bracken McLeod, Billy Martin, Elizabeth Massey, John M. McIlvain, Hillary Monahan, James A. Moore, Eric A. Nunnally, K.L. Pereira, Michael Rowe, Kat Scully, Sherry Sebastian Gabriel, Hildy Silverman, Lucy A. Snyder, Tony Tremblay, Josh Waterman, Rath James White, Chet Williamson, and Craig Wolf. Again, I am so honored and so humbled by all of you. Thank you. And now, without further ado, an excerpt from my story. I'm going to pick it up a little of the ways in. My story is about a first grade teacher named Mrs. Mary Doyle marking papers on a Friday afternoon. She opened the directory for this week's math quiz, slid the first paper off the pile, and entered the student's ID number, Ryan Jones, number 4477851. When she turned her attention to the paper in her hand, the very first question destroyed her concentration. 6 plus 4 might be. She didn't even bother to check if the student had answered correctly. She used to check, just for her own edification and to keep a rough tally in her head of which children were doing well and which were struggling. That practice had been slowly worn out of her over the years, stripped clean like the treads wearing off a tire. The question itself saw that a silly little matter like being right didn't matter at all. That symbol, which used to stand for approximately, had morphed over the decades to signify might be. How can any reply be wrong when the question asks what the answer might be? It can't. Mrs. Mary dutifully marked every question with the acceptable check mark, entered the satisfactory S next to Ryan Jones's name, and scanned the document into the system as she was required. Welcome to teaching in the world of alternative facts, she sighed within her head. Mrs. Mary chuckled and snapped herself back to her task at hand. Any time the lack of effort required from her job began to get to her, the poem First They Came by Martine Niemöller popped into her head. Except she always changed the first line. First they came for the science teachers. Mrs. Mary never expected they would come for her classroom. For God's sake, she taught 6-year-olds. They played and colored half the day. Some of her kids even regularly dozed off on the carpet during story time. Who would ever politicize first graders and change her curriculum of learning how to share? Besides, her husband had worked for the military, and the government's massive increase in defense spending had tripled his salary and paid off their mortgage. Still, guilt racked her because she should have known better. She'd said nothing when they attacked her colleagues who taught science at high schools and colleges, professors who were shouted down because their facts didn't fit a particular religious or financial agenda. Maybe the climate isn't really changing, they'd argued, using the science's need for empirical certainty against them. You can't really say with 100% clarity, can you? After that, they started revising the history books. Maybe Hitler wasn't really that bad. After all, his rise to power was impressive, so there must have been some good things about him that are worth studying and replicating, right? That was quickly followed by, maybe the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 weren't really trained by the governments from which we buy the most oil. After all, they're all dead and we weren't there, so we can't really say for certain, can we? Maybe. Mrs. Mary had spent her entire life teaching children how to read and to love words, and she truly believed there was no such thing as a bad word. But she had grown to hate maybe. She had seen it used too often as a weapon to pull at the loose threads of the sweater of reality. It had been way too late to do anything by the time they reached her classroom door. The Department of Education had been disbanded, and all public schools replaced by those run by the corporations. The elite corporate schools, which trained students to be doctors and lawyers and engineers, were reserved for the offsprings of doctors and lawyers and engineers. Middle-class parents felt lucky to pay to have their children educated at all. The alternative options, like putting their kids to work harvesting produce or cleaning hotels and office buildings, were ghastly. After all, someone had to replace all the undocumented workers they'd kicked out of the country. Mrs. Mary knew the only reason she'd been offered a job at a corporate-run school in the first place was because of her husband. No matter how hard she bit her tongue, Mrs. Mary could never accept how much her job had changed. The truth may be subjective, not that she could remember the last time anyone had read Kierkegaard, but to her, facts weren't. That was her job at the most basic level, to start instilling simple facts into young minds. She thought of it like laying the soil for a garden, the essential first layer from which everything else would grow. But that wasn't allowed anymore. Reading and writing had been replaced with learning how to shape your narrative. In other words, if the facts didn't support what you wanted them to support, change the facts rather than your opinion. Don't bother to actually learn anything. Just learn how to twist the world so that you never have to. Alternative spellings and sentence structures were now entirely acceptable. Heck, even arithmetic was a matter of opinion. It had taken a long time to grind it out of her, but Mrs. Mary had come to accept that she wasn't a teacher anymore, no matter what it said on her W-2. She was a trainer, a conditioner. She was a machine on an assembly line that cranked out generation after generation of cookie-cutter, obedient, and unexceptional worker bees who wouldn't know any better and would never rock the boat. Mrs. Mary was nearing the end of her stack of papers when she came to the math quiz of Mackenzie Regan, number 6614533. Mackenzie was a wiggle worm whom Mrs. Mary frequently noticed kicking her feet under her desk and wringing her own hands. In a different age, it would have been Mrs. Mary's responsibility to talk to her parents and advise them that their daughter might have sensory issues, but speaking with a parent now was strictly and solely the responsibility of the customer service department. In fact, she'd almost lost her job a few years earlier when she tried to raise a red flag over the finger pad bruises she'd noticed wrapped around a little boy's wrist. As if by rote, Mrs. Mary logged Mackenzie's number into the system and began to check the first line of her quiz. But then it actually caught her eye. 6 plus 4 equals 10. Mackenzie had drawn a huge black X over the might be symbol, written in her own equals sign, and answered the question correctly. When Mrs. Mary returned her fallen jaw to its normal position, her mouth curled into the first smile she could remember a child's paper eliciting in years. That smile only grew wider as she reviewed the rest of Mackenzie's quiz. 11 minus 3 equals 8. 2 plus 7 equals 9. And onward down the paper, every question changed and answered correctly. Mackenzie knew the answers. She knew the facts, and she wasn't going to answer the questions incorrectly. 6 plus 4 wasn't maybe 10. 6 plus 4 equaled 10. 11 minus 3 equaled 8. 2 plus 7 equaled 9. She was right. She knew it, and Mackenzie wasn't about to hedge her bets and suggest what the answers might be. And she'd filled out her quiz in ink rather than in pencil. When the initial shock wore off, Mrs. Mary scrambled through her monolith of marked papers to find all of Mackenzie's other quizzes, the ones she had already absent-mindedly checked off and entered into the system as satisfactory. Mackenzie had gotten every vocabulary word correct. She'd properly punctuated every sentence and correctly identified their subject and predicate. She had even aced the spelling quiz, right down to hippopotamus, which no child ever got right on their first week of first grade. And she'd filled in every blank with the same black ink. Mackenzie Regan wasn't a wiggle worm, and she wasn't wringing her hands. She was holding her own hand down to keep herself from raising it. She was hiding in plain sight, but the math quiz had been too much for her to stand. She had to correct the quiz before she correctly answered it. Which was when the smile vanished from Mrs. Mary's face, and a violent shudder convulsed her spine. She knew what would happen to Mackenzie if anyone ever saw her math quiz. And that's where I'm going to leave you hanging. Again, please consider purchasing The Dystopian States of America. Again, it's for one of the most essential causes there is. Our civil rights are under constant attack. Please pick up the book, enjoy some great stories, and do some good. Thank you again so much. Everyone stay safe and well.